Morning everybody, welcome to this week's Facebook Live, which is back in the kitchen because the builders are back next door and they've got quite a lot of noisy work to do today. So ages ago, Philippa Mullins put on Facebook, why are all these church leaders broadcasting from their kitchen? I'm like, well, today we're back in the kitchen because of the drilling noises, but that's fine, should be fine. The dog might appear if he is curious, but there we go. So today we're going to think about Sarah, one of the Women in the Bible series that we're doing. And I'm going to start by reading a bit from Genesis 17, beginning at verse 9. So God said to Abraham, "As for you, you shall keep my covenant and your offspring after you throughout their generations. This is my covenant, which you shall keep between me and you and your offspring after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised. You shall circumcise the flesh of your foreskins, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and you. Throughout your generations, every male among you shall be circumcised when he is 8 days old, including the slave born in your house and the one bought with your money from any foreigner who is not your offspring. Both the slave born in your house and the one bought with your money must be circumcised. So shall my covenant be in your flesh, an everlasting covenant. Any uncircumcised male who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin shall be cut off from his people and has broken my covenant." God said to Abraham, "As for Sarai, your wife, you shall not call her Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. I will bless her, and moreover I will give you a son by her. I will bless her, and she shall give rise to nations. Kings of people shall come from her." Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed, and said to himself, "Can a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? Can Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child?" And Abraham said to God, "Oh, that Ishmael might live in your sight." God said, "No, but your wife Sarah shall bear you a son, and you shall call him Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his offspring after him. As for Ishmael, I have heard you. I will bless him and make him fruitful and exceedingly numerous. He shall be the father of 12 princes, and I will make him a great nation. But my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah shall bear to you at this season next year." And when he had finished talking with him, God went up from Abraham. Then Abraham took his son Ishmael and all the slaves born in his house or brought with his money, every male among them of Abraham's house, and he circumcised the flesh of their foreskins that very day, as God had said to him. Abraham was 99 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin, and his son Ishmael was 13 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. That very day Abraham and his son Ishmael were circumcised, and all the men of his house, slaves born in the house and those brought with money from a foreigner, were circumcised with him. So that's the bit. There's a lot of story. Have a read of all that bit around that part of Genesis if you want to look a bit more at it. So Sarah, and she was Sarai at the time, Sarah and Abraham, they left Ur. Ur is a Mesopotamian town, now Iraq. So they left Ur and they travelled, and it was a really radical thing for them to do. They were moving from place to place. Abraham was having these encounters with God and was meeting God there. And you know, I talk about this all the time, about Abraham making this great journey into monotheism. So your gods are not associated with a place, but Abraham was learning that all of God was everywhere. That's why he built all these altars, so that there'd be a marker, so that if he felt he'd gone somewhere and lost God, he could go back to the last place where he found God and where he knew God was. So Abraham is making this journey, and Sarah is going along with him, and with quite a lot of other people as well, with members of their household, with livestock, with slaves, with all sorts of things. So Sarah and Abraham are the first kind of historical family that we know. They have They come from a place which we know existed. We have access to tablets. We know all sorts of accounting from the clay tablets. We know something about their legends, of the understanding of what the people around them thought as they were making this journey to monotheism, about some of the creation myths. We have records of that. We have shopping lists in clay tablets. We have all these sorts of things. So we know there's a historical basis for knowing where Abraham and Sarah were from, the sort of culture that they came from, and how they were the first people to start making this family journey to understand one God everywhere, the monotheism thing. We know that Sarah was related to Abraham. We think she was his half-sister. So same father, different mothers. And for those of us sitting smugly in the 21st century, it's very easy for us to say, well, we're not that surprised that she wasn't that fertile then, really. It wasn't a very fertile coupling. But God had made these promises to Abraham about Sarah having a child and his offspring being as many as the stars in the sky and grains of sand in the desert. God had made all these promises to Abraham, and yet Sarah and Abraham continued to live in a very difficult place and a very dangerous place. Now, I am always very cross with Abraham for some of these actions, but they were both of them trying to save their own lives, really, when we think about it. So there's a famine and they go to Egypt, and Sarah ends up being taken to Pharaoh's harem, which doesn't seem a very sensible thing to do if God has promised that you are going to bear a child through your wife and you have let her go to Pharaoh's harem. We think it's stupid, but also they were foreigners in Egypt, and if you didn't do what Pharaoh said, you were in big and potentially fatal trouble. So God sends plagues, he gets Sarah out of the harem, he rescues her. This is probably where she gets Hagar, the slave, from her time in Egypt. So Hagar becomes Sarah's slave. Now, this is where it all gets even more interesting, because after all these years of not having a child, and Hagar is technically, legally, Sarah's property. So Sarah decides that she is going to act on a technicality and gives Hagar to Abraham so that Hagar can be their surrogate. Technically, a child will be Sarah's child because Hagar belongs to Sarah. And this happens, and they have this arrangement. Ishmael is born. It's difficult. They're all living together. Hagar runs away. God sends her back. It's heartbreaking in that situation. Still for Sarah, has she done what God wanted? Did she not do what God wanted? She did what she thought God wanted on a technicality. She thought it would sort it all out, but it didn't sort it all out, because that isn't what God had promised. God had promised that Sarah would have a child, and it would be Abraham's child. And that's hard. It's a really hard place to be in. You have to remember what their life was like. They were nomads, herding, going from place to place, living in tents, doing that whole kind of thing we enjoy for 2 weeks, camping, but that was their life. And so then they have the promise again that Sarah will be the one to bear the child. Sarah will be the one, and God says you call him Isaac. Abraham's laughing at God again. Don't laugh at God. Doesn't work. Laugh with God. That's great. Don't laugh at God. So Abraham tries to say to God, no, I've got a son and he's Ishmael, and prays to God for Ishmael, which is a good thing to do. And God says, I've heard you about Ishmael, and Ishmael will be great. but he's not the son that I'm talking about. Your son with Sarah is the one that I'm talking about. And Sarah, then they get a visit from these 3 angels, and then Sarah laughs. These 3 people come to visit and say, no, this time next year you'll have a son. She's like, oh, really? Really? God, you are having a joke again. And then Abimelech comes along. Now, this is really interesting. Abimelech takes a fancy to Sarah, even though she's 90. I think the whole how did counting work and how do you count someone's years is an interesting question at this point, where some of the counting systems will 1, 2, 3, loads. Sometimes they didn't even have 3, sometimes they have 1, 2, more than 1. Very many years. So interestingly, so Abimelech then takes Sarah into his harem. And God has to give Abimelech a dream saying, give Sarah back. They're Muppets. Give Sarah back to Abraham. She's married to Abraham. Yes, I know it's his sister as well. It's all very complicated. Abimelech, just hand her back. Then Sarah gets pregnant and she has Isaac. There's no suggestion that he's immaculately conceived. So presumably Abraham has played his part as well. Perhaps in gratitude of getting her back from Abimelech. So what can we learn from Sarah? I mean, it's an interesting question, isn't it? Her life is hugely complicated and she is living in a situation and a culture which we find really hard to access. Not only just the whole slavery thing, perfectly acceptable in that sort of situation that they have there, very culturally acceptable. I'm not saying it's perfectly acceptable now. No. I'm saying for them it was normal, not normal, not good, not really what God wants at all. And so Sarah is a woman of her time who's been brought up in one belief system, who is struggling with her husband to work out what this other belief system really means, whilst at the time being subject to oppression, starvation, famine, wandering around in the desert and being handed over to various people's harems as the way to save the rest of her family. So I've been really thinking about what to say about Sarah, and I think there's this kind of temptation, isn't there? The first thing I want to say is that sometimes when God says do something, we say, oh well, this is nearly the right way of doing it, this technically is the right way of doing it. And the whole thing with Hagar, technically the right way. I mean, the thing that I've gone back to whilst preparing for today is that I've always been really kind of anxious about the whole you have to send Hagar away with Ishmael thing, but Ishmael's already 20 at that point. So yeah, whilst Hagar is upset about her son and it's still a terrible thing to do, and all this, and God has to send them water, it's not a little boy. It's not a little boy. Somehow that feels better in my head. And he was a man at that point and was going on to found these great nations which God had promised him. So Sarah tried to do God's will in a technicality sort of way, and that isn't normally what God is wanting. But I think the main thing for Sarah is that she lives this hugely complex life which is affected by the men and the power systems, by all these things that's going on around her. But I was really struck by the fact that all this did not get in the way of God's will. Whatever Sarah and Abraham and Pharaoh and Abimelech and Hagar and everybody did, whatever mistakes they made, however they thought they were working for God's will, however it looked like the mistakes that they made were going to make it not happen, it didn't matter in the end because God sorted it out and his will in their lives came through. Lots of people were hurt on the way. There were mistakes, there was hurt, there was pain, but God's will came through everything that they did. And there's been some little things on the internet that says, whatever you think that you have done to mess up your life, whatever you've done which makes you think you can't fulfill God's will in your life. Don't kid yourself that you're that powerful. And Sarah's an example of that people make mistakes. First historical family made hundreds and hundreds of mistakes, but God acted through their lives in the way that he wanted, however many mistakes they had made. So today, when we think about Sarah and we think about the difficulties of her circumstances, the mistakes that she made, the choices she was forced into, all of those things, but it still did not stop God acting through her to fulfill his promise. And that's true for Sarah, and it's still true for all of us, that God will act through us if we let him, whatever mistakes we have made and whatever circumstances of oppression we have found ourselves in, that God can still act. We are not powerful enough to take that away from God's power. So that's what I wanted to say about Sarah today. Have a look, have a read, have a look at the ages and the times and kind of the time frames for things. And so Genesis 17 is this kind of bit in the middle. So if you start earlier and go on until Genesis 20, then you'll be able to have a good look at what's going on in this first family's life. See you soon.